So I recently acquired a 3D printer, and I couldn't be more excited. Well, not that kind of 3D printer. This kind of 3D printer. Now, I'll be the first to admit that this has come with its own challenges, most of which ends up being slightly my own incompetence, and I will be making a full video on how to avoid those follies in the future for anybody else who is interested in actually learning more about 3D printing, or at least resin 3D printing. But as you can see, the miniatures on the screen look pretty good, and for free files, I think they're a really great addition to anybody's miniature collection. But enough of my babbling, let's get on with the video and let's see how I painted these up today. So I had a request for a good old-fashioned sit down and paint video. No real plan going into things, nothing really on the menu, so to speak. This isn't from anything in particular, and there are 3 carbon copies. So what we're going to do is we're going to go for 3 similar but distinctly different paint jobs. And what I mean by distinctly different is I wanted them to be different enough that if I use them in a D&D game, my players could tell the difference between the 3 of them and identify them easily in combat. So that way we weren't taking enough time going, well, are you attacking this one? Are you attacking that one? But I also wanted them to look good enough that I could use them as proxy models in other roleplay games. So I started where I always start with my miniatures, and I zenithally primed them. Now, the only thing that I will say that I did differently according to a normal zenithal prime is I started with gray and I went all the way up to white. You'll notice that there's very little black on here, and it's only in the deepest, darkest recesses. And that's mostly because I'm running low on black spray paint, but also because I wanted the colors to be quite vibrant. And I knew if I put too much black on here, I was going to ruin that zenithal effect. So one of the things I really struggle with is when I started learning how to paint miniatures, I started with GW miniatures, and that's not to say that that's necessarily a bad thing, but what it means is that I started out with GW's way of painting. And although it's GW's way of painting, there's nothing necessarily wrong with it. It's definitely not beginner friendly, and you start falling into these tropes where you constantly fall back on what you know. And if you know their style, their heavy metal style, it's very iconic and it's very recognizable, and when people do that on other brands of miniatures, it's pretty obvious where they've gotten it from. And although it does work really, really well for things like science fiction armor and such, it's not necessarily the most realistic, and it's also not the style where you're really going to evolve past it. There's a certain point where it gets about as good as it gets, and although I admit I'm far from that, I don't want to end up there as it being my sole way of painting. So much like my favorite podcast, Paint Bravely, I want to start painting bravely. I want to start painting boldly, and I really want to start using colors in ways that I don't normally use it. Normally I would, highlight from darks to lights, and I want to start kind of doing lights to darks, which I feel work really well for magical creatures or even some kind of furry or scaly woodland creatures. Something I'm really excited to try on in the future, and it was definitely something that was in my mind while I was working on these, but I just didn't take it far enough. I'm really disappointed in myself for not taking that as far as I could have, but in the meantime, this is what we've got going on. Starting with a Death World Forest green, I wanted to go ahead and lay in these base tones to kind of give a druidic feel. We end up laying in a lot of our highlights using dry brushing and using a little bit of edge highlighting, but for the most part all 3 of these models end up getting dry brushed quite a lot. I really wanted to show off what dry brushing could do in this video so that those of you who follow me who have shaky hands or maybe can't see as well as you used to can really see that you can get a really wonderful and beautiful miniature using a simple technique such as dry brushing. It's really important to me that you guys understand that you can get a great looking model without a ton of effort or without a ton of skill, or maybe if you've lost some skill. So like I said, I really wanted to paint bravely, but one of the things I wanted to do is I wanted to have each of these models to have 2 distinctive tones on them, one significantly brighter than the other, whether it been on the bottom or the top. And I decided to go with a super bright moot green here on the bottom of this miniature. And although it ends up getting dulled down quite a bit with some of the edge highlights because I just kept going brighter instead of going darker like I had intended to, I still was really happy with the final color and how everything turned out. I normally don't start with a vibrancy like this in my base tones, and I am happy that I took that plunge, but again, I wish I had just taken it one step farther. I ended up mixing in a lot of Deathworld Forest as well as Deathguard Green into this miniature, and I started with my moot green and basically blended out into the highlight colors. So we never got a pure color. I ended up using some pure Deathworld Forest directly onto the front centerpiece, that little shawl that kind of hangs down, but I was never quite happy with the colors, although once it's all said and done and I get the headdress sorted out, I am really happy with the miniature. I remember the texture of this dress giving me this really leafy vibe, and I really wanted to continue that feel, so I wanted to mix some yellows and some oranges together to get this highlight color. And I ended up adding just a bit more yellow down the line toward the end of everything because it ends up darkening as it dries, so that it just didn't look right. So I add some yellow back in to get it to what you can see here on screen, but yeah, I was just trying to channel nature, and I wanted it to feel leafy and green and lively, and I just really liked the look I was able to get once it's all said and done. I think this would make a great stand-in for some kind of like elder druid or something like that. I end up adding just a tiny bit of Lauren Forest to kind of knock it back into the green department, and then end up using this as a edge highlight. This is one of the few models that I actually put edge highlights on, and I end up continuing the edge highlight around the bottom part of that top shawl. And I do that on all the other miniatures, but other than that, everything was pretty much done with dry brushing. Now I wanted to go for more purplish tones in this one, whether that been in the highlights or the base tones. So I started with the bottom of the dress, trying to keep with that tradition of keeping the bottom the darker color. And I just went in with a mixture of Xarius purple and Genestealer purple, although there was significantly more Xarius. I quickly decided to keep this as our primary color throughout the course of the model, but I ran into an issue, and that seems to be that these 3D printed miniatures seem to be much more finicky when it comes to the amount of water that you put in your paint. And it seemed to not matter whether I was using flow improver or water. And I realized that I really needed to basically be painting straight out of the pot for the first coat on these. And I don't know if that's the nature of the plastic that or the resin I should say, that I printed from, or if I was just doing something wrong here. And that's something that's going to need to be experimented with on my own time, but I wanted to explain what was happening there on the back of the miniature. For my first layer of highlights, I pretty much go exclusively with Xarius purple, and I go pretty ham-fisted with that at first, and then I go very lightly in the top of the arms and anywhere where there's curves on the body. And then I realized that I really wanted the top to have some red and orange to it, so I end up mixing a little bit of Jericho orange into Wild Rider red, and that's the color you can see me dry brushing on now. Now every now and again you see me wiping away at the model, and that's because I'm trying to keep the highlights on the upper edges of the model where light would be showing. So the top of the chest, the top of the arms, and on the back of the cloak where her curves kind of make the dress kind of stick out a bit. Now I ended up using a color called Spectral White here, and that's from Reaper Miniatures, and I use it as my edge highlight tone for the bottom of that dress, and I do just a little bit of direct dry brushing across the front and very little across the back, and that's just kind of to set in the extreme highlights. Starting out with Ultramarine's contrast paint. Now if you don't have contrast paints, just a nice deep dark blue would work with this type of situation. I wanted to make sure that I had distinctly different colors, but I am going to be blending into the purple spectrum for this one, although I do it in a bit of a different way than what we've already done. I decided for the bright colors on this one, I wanted to go into a bit of a bright teal blue. So we're moving into almost like a Stegodon scale green here. Now I'm actually setting us up with a Cantor blue base, but I'm very heavily fistily putting it on, meaning I'm using lots of pigments. There's very few places where that original blue really shows through. You can see I'm just kind of almost gooping it on here with this dry brush. I'm doing this in this way mostly because it's creating texture, though. There are certain places where that blue is originally showing through, and there are places where it is just overwhelmed with this new color, and that creates a lot of nice texture to go on underneath all of our dry brushing that we're going to be doing next. As you can see here, I've just slowly been adding more and more green to our blue, getting it more into this teal range, and I just keep reapplying that, adding them to less and less of the surface area, making sure that more and more of that brighter color only ends up in the curves and the upper part of the chest region as well as the upper part of the arms. I'm trying to make it so that only areas that are exposed by the light or areas of the fabric that may be pulled taut are the parts that are the lightest. Using Ice Blue here from Reaper Miniatures, I'm doing that nice edge highlight around the bottom half of that top section of the dress, and I end up using a little bit of this as our final highlight color later on. Mixing my original tone and a little bit of Gene Stealer Purple, I'm starting to lay in those initial highlights. Now I do wish I had gone a little bit darker, but I am very happy again with the final result of all three miniatures. My intention at this point was to try to reinforce the blue colors by adding in a bit of a blue wash, again using the ultramarine contrast paint. Really all this ended up doing is it basically reinforced the purple tones, and I just went forward from there. I didn't want to go back in and try to fix things and bring it back into the blues. I left it in the purple region and I went forward from that point. And then I came in with some pure Everland Sunset to really bring that yellowy tone back. Again, I'm going for more of this autumn leaf feel with this color. And I just really didn't like the way that it had dried, so I'm just bringing some of that yellow in and just really brightening it up and making sure that the curves get a proper amount of highlighting where it needs to be. I end up using Incubi Darkness to lay in the initial tones on the cowling around the neck area. Now, I know that the camera is going to go in and out of focus a few times here, and I do apologize. If I had noticed this before I'd hit record on this section, well, it wouldn't have happened. But just know that I am going in with this color, and then I'm going to be doing similar to how I do my Warpstone. I'm going to be using Warpstone Glow followed by Moot Green. And these are progressively lighter and lighter highlights, and I also end up painting over the face, which would end up being a bit of a mistake. I thought, well, it didn't really matter, and I'm going to paint them all the same color, but it ends up muddying up some of the details at the end, and that's a mistake that I would avoid if you were following along at home. Now you can see me layering in the Warpstone Glow, which I just end up abandoning off screen for dry brushing, and it works just as well. I was spending a little too much time. The only thing that I would do with a brush is when you go to apply it to the back and the front of this large headpiece, I do recommend streaking it with a layer brush instead of trying to dry brush it, because it gives a lot of texture to just add these streaky lines in these almost seemingly random patterns, as opposed to going in for a full dry brush. And then the only other thing that I really edge highlight with the Moot Green is this cowling as well, this big headpiece. There's some really nice sharp lines on the outside that I edge highlight, but that's really about it. Once again, I thought I was doing myself some favors here, and although it does give me some nice stark highlights, I end up just completely abandoning this again and doing dry brushing off screen. In the face, starting out with Bugman's Glow, this is to give some color to everything, and this is where it goes wrong because I'm layering a dark color on top of a dark color. Now, if I had planned to do these more like tieflings or something like that, starting out from this deep blue would have been a really great starting point. But unfortunately, because I'm not, I should have left it white and then done my Bugman's Glow, and I would have had a less muddy color when I was done. Now, I end up slowly adding in some Kislev flesh with this, and that's how I get my highlights in the next stage. And on certain miniatures, I use more and less, so that all three of them have slightly different face tones to them. Now, just to put a bit of a prerequisite in here, I end up skipping where I do the bases because we've done bases here on the channel before, but if you guys want to see more tutorials on how to do bases, leave ideas for that in the comments, and who knows, maybe I'll make a whole video just dedicated to making bases based on your suggestions. And if I do that, then I will totally give you guys a shout out in the video itself, thanking you for the recommendation for doing that base and inspiring that base. But cutting forward, I have these really awesome little 3D printed mushrooms that I end up basing with some wraithbone, and then I use a mixture of colors between reds, whites, and blues, and I even use a little bit of purple in there. Now, I'm willing to admit I messed up here. If you look back at the beginning of this video, you'll see that there is some gold trim missing. Now, I did talk originally when I recorded about putting the gold trim on, and I completely forgot. I was really happy with how things turned out, but I forgot to put gold trim on. Now I'm going to be adding that so you can see that here in the final video, and it should be pretty obvious about where that gold trim goes. But the reason we waited until last is because it's an enamel paint, which means that it's strong enough on its own that it doesn't need any kind of cover on top of it. But it also means that if I had used a cover such as Tester's dull coat or Tester's gloss coat, it messes up the finish. And I have to put that on after everything is done because it's a non-alcohol based paint. It's a oil based paint, and it reacts really badly to that finishing top coat. So I'm going to go ahead and fix that right now, and then I'm going to re-record the end of this video so you guys can see it proper. And there you have it, guys. Thank you guys so much for all the love and support. It has blown my mind how much you guys have really enjoyed my content, and I'm making strides to improve and become better every single day. If you guys really love this and you want to support me, you can actually just hit the like button. That does a great job at boosting us out there and making it so that other people can see this content. And it really helps the channel to grow, so I appreciate it if you do that. And share it with other people that you think would enjoy this content as well. If you'd like to help monetarily, there's great ways to do that in the link tree, and all those ways will earn you a free shout out in a video in the future. But as always, no more of that. This is the end of the video. Thank you guys so much for all the love and the support, and I hope your display case is always full and your pile of shame never runs empty. Until next time, guys.